Hi guys, welcome to the Fort Daily Demos. Today's exercise is really just ellipse exercises and a warm-up kind of cylinder. It's really just meant to be a warm-up exercise and not really much of a design creative as much as it is just warming up the hand and the arm and setting up our ellipses, working on our ellipse logic sequence. This is not exactly fundamentals, but it is just for warm-up of our arm and our eye. Establishing a vertical center line and coming through and just establishing both inside and outside kind of bulging curvature to this particular thermos, and fleshing in some contour lines on the surface. Initially they were horizontally as well as the verticals, and now just kind of laying in a little bit of directionality for my viewers, for my students in my classroom. Understand that I'm establishing a sight line to vanishing point off to the left and off to the right. That helps me anchor this handle that I'm fleshing out so that it comes out towards us into the scene a little bit. Very often beginning designers tend to put the handle tucked around the back or behind the profile edges, and it's not as demonstrative of the form or of the handle, and it's just not as engaging and exciting of a drawing. Here I'm just coming in, starting to tighten up some of these ellipses that define the contours, fleshing in sort of a slanted pitch to maybe the drinking surface of this lid. And I'm beginning to articulate that this thing is going to be consist of a couple different materials at least. Maybe sort of a brushed metal lid at the top that maybe screws in or presses in tightly with like a kind of a rubber O-ring or something of that sort to seal it. And then the cylinder body might be a different material. In this case, I'm going to render this green. This is not a pre-rehearsed sketch by any means. I'm a big believer in my demos with my students being real-time and really unscripted. So I go in more or less cold on the particular drawing that I'm working on, so that they can see real world or real-time adaptation and adjustment, and sometimes you make mistakes on the fly and just sort of adapt to it. Here I'm starting to flesh in maybe an ellipse or cylinder, some more cylinder warm-up, but perhaps something that's part of my design thinking on this particular object, and maybe that starts to work its way into the background as kind of a framing element. You can see today I'm spinning my paper around a lot more than in my normal demos to really try to hold those ellipses, establish my vertical centers, and be a little bit more natural to my drawing process. And in this little background form, I'm not going to articulate it very far or very deeply. I'm obviously drawing it at a larger scale than the foreground thermos. Perhaps these are objects that are part of a design family. Maybe that's a lid that's lifting up or something along those lines. Really, I'm just describing that you can have other elements going on your sheet or on your page that you don't flesh out to the same degree as maybe a foreground object. And now I'm starting to lay in, obviously, with some marker. I think today I'm just using neutral grays on this, and just starting to lay in more or less where the core shade might be on this form. I haven't sketched the shadow on the ground yet. That'll come a little bit later in the demo. I like to put a little bit of value off on the left edge over there, and spend a little time here talking about the handle. The handle's a black rubber. Again, beginning design students have a tendency to think whites and blacks are just, you just leave the paper blank for white and you fill in a big black blob for black objects. But in fact, you have to have your three-plane logic intact. Yeah, you still have to consider that there are highlights on that black, there are lowlights on the black. And so we read black values in a dark palette, but not necessarily just simply a big black mass. So I've spent a little time sort of talking about that with the students, and then come back in, lay down a base value that's maybe in the 40% range, and then just start working up and developing the surface from there. This handle is a little bit maybe considered somewhat of a complex form because it has multiple radiuses and curvatures on the different edges. And therefore you have to allow there to be a bit of highlight on some of those corner noses and radius or radii. Here I'm just kind of fleshing in a little bit more depth and value, tonality range, talking about the shade side of the form, perhaps being a little bit lower light, softening up the core shade value, and stepping it over with number 2s and number 3 markers a little bit to create a little bit more gradation. You can see my marker work today is a bit streaky. Maybe my markers are a little bit dry. Laying in the base value of the green, which is, as you can tell, is a really vibrant, rich green today. So I'm working the green in where the core shade is, or where the strongest, richest saturation of our color palette might be. And now I'm coming in with some ground pastel and dusting the rendering and creating just a softer transition from the highlight green over to the base value green. Here I'm laying in a bit of a reflection down the cylinder form, and that reflection would be coming from the handle itself. And I'm just streaking it out using a little bit of chrome behavioral logic and recognizing the nature of that cylinder form and just kind of building in a little approximation of what that reflection might look like. The base of this thermos and its lid I'm allowing to be just a raw metal, perhaps stainless or aluminum, something along those lines, and just starting to flesh in a little bit more depth and talking about the relationship of cleaning up some of that green work, or cleaning up the chrome kind of line coming up the green work and making its way into that lid and that base. Again, you can see I'm spinning the paper around quite a bit today to really work with the natural flow of my arm. Here I'm cleaning up sort of that streak and line up the surface and starting to build in some black point values in those reflections. Our chrome and polished surfaces really pick up dark areas and streak them in a somewhat dramatic kind of way, you could say. Starting to build up the inside curvature of that lid, again reinforcing the directionality of where the light source would be. So our light source in this case is off to the left, and that means that inside vertical surface would have a little bit of depth over there on the left hand side on the inside, and then fade off towards the right. Here I'm laying in a little bit of a reflection onto that surface, so maybe this is again kind of a brushed stainless steel lid or something like that, and that might be the reflection of that little lip that's on there. What else? And now I'm just kind of laying in a little bit of a tonal value shift, get a little bit of contrast in my drawing. I'm using a kneaded eraser now to clean up a little bit or back off a little bit of that dusting that made its way onto the handle. And now going ahead and putting in, again, some more black points and more ambient kind of reflection, things from our environment that may be creating a little bit more character and dynamic to the surface and the chrome and the either painted or enameled surface, or whatever this thermos might be made of. Could be very polished plastic. It could be a polished kind of chrome metal or something of that sort. In this case, you can see also I've left my dusted pastel sloppy beyond the edges of the thermos. It's a nice stylized kind of approach sometimes. Here I'm laying in my stronger profile edges, really kind of popping it off of its background and tightening up my sketch work. If you've seen my other videos, if you're a student in my class, you know that I'm not particularly a big fan of ellipse guides. Only in the sense that I'm a firm believer in sketching as a very rapid, quick process before you take your ideas into the computer. You can see I'm working in some white Prismacolor pencil to just build in some white points and extra glare, working that right over the top of the gray values or even green values that are in there, and adding some dynamics. Here I'm starting to sketch in my shadow casting and establish that the silhouette contour of the form into that shadow. Very often students leave their really kind of leave their shadows more simplistic than the object form actually is. And so the shadow that you wind up with doesn't really convey the idea of the design of the object itself. And it's really important to have a silhouette, or sorry, a shadow that that reinforces and describes somewhat accurately the complexity of the form that you have. So after doing a bit of analysis, coming in and sort of cleaning up the ellipses and the approximation of where that handle might be, and now just kind of using a very simple parallel line kind of crosshatch approach, less of a crosshatch and really just kind of similar parallel lines. Coming in with patience and control. It's a very important fundamental that I really try and reinforce to my students. And at this point, once you have your shadow really well established, you can sort of drift it and fade it off like that to be a little bit more stylized if you like. Now here I'm just using a very simple whiteout pen. These are pretty quick and dirty. They're not exactly precise and pretty all the time, but they do get the job done, and they're convenient to carry around with you. Just putting in a little bit of extra white point highlights and glare on some of the parting edges. And there you have it, a little warm-up exercise. Hope this helps.